Horror stories, scary Reddit stories. Every day on my way to work, I passed the cemetery on Richmond Road. I'd always thought there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the overgrown grass, the washed-out tombstones, the fact that it was always empty, or the lack of flowers on any of the graves. I don't know exactly what it was, but whenever the bus drove by, I was left with a strange feeling in my gut. The cemetery seemed unreal somehow, like trying to look through a window, only to discover it was just a painting on the wall. There were no churches or mortuaries nearby and no identifying features, just a graveyard on its own, seemingly out of place. It wasn't until my mother's funeral a few months ago that I became compelled to look into it. See, the cemetery where she was buried, across town so she could be with her parents, had an entire different atmosphere. It had a sort of weight to it, a weight that the cemetery on Richmond Road lacked. It was the difference between being alone in a crowd and being alone in a house. Even when I returned to the graveside on my own, the cemetery still had a presence of sorts, almost as though it was buzzing with life, whereas the one on Richmond Road felt stale, clinical, and sterile. I started asking around at work. My curiosity only grew when I realized nobody knew anyone who'd been buried there, not even distant relatives. The mystery quickly became an obsession of mine, a burning curiosity that couldn't be quelled unless I knew the truth. I would have to dig deeper to find it. My first step was to consult the records at City Hall. According to official documents, the cemetery land was in an industrial zone, unlike the community cemeteries, which were marked as urban services zones. My next step was to find out who owned the land. Unfortunately, I couldn't gather any information on its current owners. I tried researching who originally bought it, but the graveyard's inception predated the available records. My final step was sorting through decades of city maps, hoping to come up with a timeline for the graveyard's construction. If I could narrow down when it was established, I could focus my research. Pre-60s era maps identified it as a forested area, while post-60s era maps had it blocked off entirely. For all intents and purposes, the graveyard shouldn't have existed. One evening when my curiosity boiled over, I wandered into the graveyard. You could say that I broke in, but the gate wasn't locked, and I didn't see a keep-out sign. As I strolled through the unkempt rows of tombstones, I realized something. They were identical, save for the names on the front. Same size, same rate of decay, same type of marble. They were spaced out in identical, perfectly aligned rows. All factors that contributed to the graveyard lacking a touch of human warmth. The most chilling detail, however, had to be the year etched on their polished surfaces. Every single one was marked 1965, leading me to wonder if I was standing in some sort of war monument. But the era was wrong. What did this mass grave signify? I can't quite explain why, but as I stood in the graveyard with only the sound of the frigid wind to keep me company, I couldn't help but think the graves I was standing on were empty. In my mind, I could picture hundreds of caskets, their silk linings still in pristine condition, and their pillows plump and untouched. A strange thought, perhaps, but one I couldn't shake. It was then that I saw a spade resting against a nearby tree. Rust circled up the shaft like climbing vines, eating away at the metallic green paint on its surface. The spade had been left out in the elements for too long, I figured. I eyed it for a long moment, unable to make up my mind. I was alone. I had the opportunity to prove my theory. All these months, no, years of unanswered questions, and I finally had a chance to get to the bottom of them. My fingers wrapped around the handle. I pulled the spade over my head and glared at the foot of the nearest grave. My body tensed, my heart raced. Could I really do it? I was trembling, shaking in my boots. I hadn't even done anything yet, but I was already drowning with guilt and regret. What was I doing? What was I expecting to find buried beneath the ground? I was sickened by my own morbid thoughts and actions. This obsession had to end. How could I have let it get this far? I lowered my arms, took a step back, and hung my head in shame. I didn't have time to dwell on the shame for too long. Footsteps broke through the silence of the night. I could feel blood draining from my face as I froze where I stood. Had the cops come to arrest me for trespassing? I wanted to run, but I was afraid I'd get into even more trouble if I did. I knew someone was bound to get curious eventually, said a calm voice. I reflexively clutched the spade tightly and held it against my chest as I turned around to face the speaker. There was an old man peering at me. He was wearing a knitted sweater, brown pants, and tattered black shoes. The crow's feet around his eyes stretched as he smiled softly. "You're curious about the grave, right?" he murmured, motioning towards the plot. I stared at him, speechless. I'd been caught with my hand in the cookie jar and didn't quite know how to explain myself. There was no lie in the world that could properly justify my actions. My face twisted as I racked my brain trying to come up with a response, but my thoughts fluttered away in every direction, like dandelion fuzz in the breeze. "Well, don't just stand there," he said, motioning for me to come closer. Shivering, I blindly obeyed and bridged the distance between us. He smiled and looked me in the eyes. "Come, let's get you warmed up with some coffee. I'm sure you must have questions." My fingers squeezed the spade protectively. I shyly averted my gaze from the stranger and lowered my head closer to my shoulders, trying to make myself smaller. "Not much of a talker, are you?" he asked, letting out a soft chuckle. He extended his arm towards the back of the property, where I could just barely make out the outline of a building. "Come on now, don't be shy." Still looking away, I loosened my grip and inched towards the tree. I placed the spade right back where I'd found it. As soon as I let go, it toppled over. I reached down to grab it, but felt a hand on my shoulder to stop me. "It's fine, just leave it. Come on, I promise I won't bite." He didn't sound sinister. His voice was calm, warm, and welcoming. He was the embodiment of a grandfather, but still, something put me ill at ease. Was it him, or the shame and disgust I was feeling at myself? His hand moved from my shoulder to my back. I felt him push against it very lightly, like a parent guiding their child. I found myself walking along, unable to speak or look at anything but my own 2 feet. "I'll explain everything once we get inside," he assured me. He led me to a concrete building at the very outskirts of the cemetery. Though the outside was cold and unwelcoming, the inside had a homely feel to it. There were couches, an old television, and a bed in the corner. It almost looked like a hunter's cabin, minus the shotguns and animals' hides. On the bookshelf in the corner was a large framed photo of half a dozen people wearing lab coats. It had to have been quite old, judging by its grainy texture, lack of color, and the outdated hairstyles of the men and women photographed therein. "Have a seat. I'll be right back," he said. He disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me to meander around the living room. I could have run away at that point, but I was paralyzed, mortified by what I'd done. I could hear the sounds of a coffee maker gurgling from the other room and ceramic cups clanging against one another. "Do you take anything with your coffee? Sugar, milk, cream?" he asked as he returned with a fresh cup. "SHSH sug." The words wouldn't come out. I swallowed and cleared my throat. "Sugar, please." He clapped his hands together and chuckled. "So he speaks." My cheeks flushed red with embarrassment. He handed me the cup of coffee. "Name?" "Isaiah." Odd name for someone so young. My mother was religious. "You?" "No." "Tell me, do you believe in the soul?" "No." He smiled a knowing smile. "So tell me, Isaiah, what were you doing digging up the grave?" My heart stopped. It was the question I was dreading. I should have spent my time coming up with an answer, but I didn't. My mind had gone blank from the moment I'd seen him to the moment he placed the cup of coffee in my hands. "Well?" he insisted. I tried to take a sip of coffee to buy some time, but it was still scalding hot. I had a hunch. That it'd be empty, I answered. He took a seat opposite from me and smiled again, nodding his head as though he'd anticipated the answer. "What if I told you that you were right?" "Am I?" He nodded. "Are they all empty? The graves, I mean?" I asked. I figured he knew. He lived on the property, after all. He nodded. "Every last coffin." "Do you want to know why?" I hesitated. Did I? Was this one of those things like in the movies where he'd tell me he was going to have to kill me if he told me the truth? I tensed, fingers digging into my kneecaps nervously. He laughed lightheartedly. "You shouldn't be so afraid of me, you know. I'm not the one digging up graves in the middle of the night," he said. "Touché. Please tell me," I finally requested. He leaned back against the chair, settling in like a storyteller preparing to weave a fantastic tale for his children. It all started back in the 60s, when he cupped a hand to his chin and squinted at me. "I'd say about your age." I was working with a team of medical researchers on improving organ transplantation. You see, back then, transplants were still fairly new. We weren't sure which organs could and couldn't be successfully transplanted. I took a sip of coffee, listening to him attentively. I wondered where he was going with this. Was he a mad scientist who disemboweled his victims just to see if he could? Would I be next? He looked longingly towards the photo on the shelf. It was while researching the brain that we realized something that brought our research to a complete standstill, something that shook us to the core of our foundation. We discovered the brain lives on, even after death. I snorted, but quickly slapped my hand over my mouth. I am so sorry. That's just not what I was expecting to hear. I pressed my lips together. I'm sorry, but what you're saying is impossible. He shook his head. It's all right. I understand your skepticism. I was skeptical too back then. But it's true. We discovered life after death, so to speak, in the form of electrical impulses. Barely noticeable, really. Even days after a body has died, the brain still sends out just the faintest of signals. You almost have to be looking for it to know it's still there. But it is. His smile faded into a solemn frown, and the brain continues to do so until it putrefies completely. I became overwhelmed with apprehension. I didn't quite understand what he was trying to say, but the mere thought of it made me uncomfortable. The hairs on my forearm stood at attention. A bead of sweat rolled down my temple and landed on my lap. I swallowed a knot in my throat. Felt like a chicken running with its head cut off, all right? He shook his head. No, that's completely different. Those are just the nerves still firing at random. What we found was, he paused, trying to come up the right word, organized. Deliberate. Messages sent through the brain. Signals that are much slower than with a living specimen and much less active, but still present. When you die, your brain is still aware of what's going on. His faded blue eyes looked into mine. Despite his age, I could see vitality behind their cloudy facade. I looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. My gaze fell on the brown liquid in the cup between my fingers. He continued, the brain is aware of everything. Do you understand what that means? I thought of the caskets in the graveyard. I was starting to understand why they were empty, even autopsies. I asked hesitantly. He brought his hands together and nodded. We cut them open like it's nothing, without realizing what we're doing. But if that wasn't bad enough, he started, his voice becoming sharper, we extend their suffering. The brain, under normal circumstances, should decay within a few days. But we chill our corpses. We embalm them so we can put them on display. We lock them up in caskets and bury them deeper in the ground. Nowadays, brains can survive weeks, sometimes even a month, longer than they should. It goes against the natural order of things. I felt ill. If he was right, if he wasn't just some crazy old coot, then I could only imagine the kind of horrors people had endured. Could they feel their bodies being cut open, embalming fluid flushing their system, and their skin being sewn and prepped for viewing? How long did they feel the four walls of their caskets closed down around them before they finally found rest? He had to be wrong. He just had to be. There's no way, I murmured tensely. He sighed. I know it's hard to believe, but it's the truth. We were all shocked. We didn't want to believe it. We performed countless tests, but we all came to the same conclusion. We couldn't do much, though. Only destroy the bodies sent to us. Make sure none of them suffered. What about all the graves? He smiled. Those are symbolic. The families know no one's buried there. We were working with bodies donated to science. The graveyard was just to give families a place to mourn and collect themselves. But since most of our specimens came from out of town, well, no one ever really bothered coming to the graveyard after the funerals, he explained. The plots were empty, after all. Why make the trip? What about everyone else? The ones who weren't sent to you? Everyone who's been buried since then? I asked. My leg began to tremble from nervous agitation as I worried about my mother, who'd been buried recently. If you're right, then that's well and good. But what about the millions of people who still get buried every year? His gaze softened. We did everything we could. We reported our findings, omitting a few details, of course. Wouldn't want to cause a panic, or worse, have our funding cut. We did help initiate long-term results. It's no coincidence that fewer and fewer people get buried nowadays, you know. Cremation is becoming common practice. But you know how bureaucracy goes. Like most things, change takes time. I sat there, head in my hands, staring at the floor while the cup of coffee cooled on the table next to me. Why tell me this? I asked. I didn't want to know. Why would anyone want to know? I could hear him shuffling in his seat. He got up, walked to the bookshelf in the corner, and grabbed the photograph. I told you out of selfishness, he answered. You see, my fellow researchers died one after the other, leaving me as the only man alive who knows the truth. He knelt down in front of me so our eyes could meet. I'm getting along in years now. It won't be long before I'm dead and gone. I don't want to suffer. I need someone to take care of me when the time comes. Please. I need you to destroy my brain. I stood up, shaking. What? No. I'm not. I'm not a killer. He laughed nervously and shook his head. No, not right now. When I die. Please. I put it in my last will and testament, but I know how these things go. They won't destroy the brain. They'll cremate me eventually, but not quickly enough. He grabbed my legs tightly and looked up at me, his calm and controlled behavior suddenly desperate and panicked. Please, I'm begging you. I don't have any living relatives. Let me mark you as a next of kin. They'll let you in. Then you can do it. Please. I don't want to suffer while I wait to be cremated. I don't want to feel the fires melting my skin. I didn't know what to say or do. What he was asking for was inhuman, but I had a feeling he wouldn't let go unless I agreed. I nodded hesitantly. All right. His grip loosened instantly. He let out a sigh of relief and pushed himself to his feet. I could see him wiping his eyes on his sleeve. Had he actually started crying? Good. Good. I'll just take down your information, he said, wobbling to the kitchen for a pen and paper pad. I know what you must be thinking. Why didn't I just give him fake info? Truth is, I was so frazzled that I reacted automatically. I gave him my address, phone number, and name. Everything. When I was done, I left. I wandered out of the graveyard, feeling shaken to the core. I hoped what he'd told me was a delusion. I hoped he'd fade away to the back of my mind, and that I'd never get a call about him. I went to bed that night and stared at the ceiling for hours, imagining decaying bodies trapped in their dark tombs, able to hear and feel, but unable to see anything or call for help. A fate worse than being buried alive. No one knew the pain they were in. They couldn't scream or scratch at the surface. They'd just lay there and feel themselves withering away. The chilling imagery kept me up well into the morning hours. Even after convincing myself that the old man was crazy, the anxiety persisted. The fear was electric, tingling at the back of my neck like someone blowing on my skin. I couldn't get the morbid thoughts out of my mind. They ate away at me like acid rain on an old swing set. And then, the phone rang. I picked it up and brought it to my ear. Hello, is this Isaiah Brown? Why, yes, I replied nervously. Had the old man reported me to the police for grave robbery? Were they going to arrest me? This is the Richmond Hospital. You were marked as an emergency contact for your great uncle. He was taken to the hospital early this morning. We're going to need you to come in. My stomach dropped. As far as I knew, I didn't have a great uncle. It had to have been the man from the night before. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to be notified of his death, especially not so soon. I should have refused to go, but something in me compelled me to comply. Less than half an hour later, I arrived at the hospital. A nurse informed me that my great-uncle had passed away. She led me to his bedside and left me there, closing the door behind her. Judging by the cleanliness of the room, it seemed as though his stay at the hospital hadn't been too chaotic, at least. There was only a crash cart in the corner and a few discarded tools as proof that he'd received treatment. I unhooked the chart hanging over the foot of his bed and read it. His name was Herbert Jones. He died at the age of 81 from heart failure. A sinking feeling in my gut told me it wasn't coincidental. Herbert had been waiting for someone like me to come along. Had he offed himself once he'd passed on his final request? I stood in front of him and stared at his lifeless body, wondering if there was any truth to what he'd told me the night before. He lay there, dead as a doorknob, eyes foggy, blank stare locked on the ceiling. But as I leaned closer and really looked into his hazy eyes, I saw something. A light. A faint sparkle of life beyond his faded irises. It was like looking into a frost-covered window on a cold winter's night and just barely seeing the outline of a family around the fireplace. Something you'd never see unless you knew to look. Was this why people usually closed the eyes of the departed? I staggered back, a chill spreading from my extremities to my heart, clutching it in a vice-like grip. I understood what I had seen, what Herbert had been talking about. The conclusion he'd tried to lead me to. I had seen his soul. Herbert was right. He was dead, but his soul hadn't left his body. It was trapped inside of him, waiting to be freed, waiting for me to free it. Hesitantly, I reached for a scalpel left behind on the tray next to his bed. I reared my arm back and stared at his head, my target. I was shaking like a leaf. Destroy the brain, I whispered to myself, in shock. The words were horrifying, the kind of words reserved for zombie movies. The instrument felt heavy in my hand, or perhaps it was the weight of responsibility that weighed it down. I wish I could say that I respected Herbert's final wishes, but I'd be lying if I did. I was too afraid of the consequences. What if a nurse walked in and caught me? What if I missed? What if the sound of his brain sloshing against the walls of his cranium haunted me for the rest of my life? I dropped the scalpel and ran out of the room, my stomach a mess of knots, my heart a caged lion roaring to escape. Herbert put his faith in me, and I let him down. I let the hospital perform their autopsy, and God knows what else. I just pray they cremated him at least.